Good afternoon. My name is Julia Klesney-Tait. I'm the medical director of the lung transplant program at the University of Iowa. On behalf of the ISHLT, my co-host John Reynolds, and our fantastic panel of experts, we'd like to welcome you to Navigating the Lung Composite Allocation Score Policy Change. We want to get straight into data for everyone on the web to be able to review. And so I'm going to get straight to our speakers. We're very fortunate to have as our first speaker, Erika Lease. She's been the medical director at the University of Washington Lung Transplant Program since 2014. She has deep experience in policy development. She served as the chair of the Lung Committee during the development of the CAS score, and she's now chair of the OPTN Policy Committee. And the title of Erika's talk today is Architecture of the Allocation Policy Development, Structural Safeguards, and the Future of the Lung CAS Scoring System. Welcome, Erika.
Great. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm really excited to be here. So I'm going to get right into it. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about historical donor lung allocation in the United States, and then include some of the drivers that led to the developing of the lung composite allocation score. And then I'll get into how OPTN policy development processes actually work. So I think it's helpful to give a timeline of organ allocation in the United States. So it gives us a little bit of context as to how we've gotten to where we are today. In the earliest days of organ allocation and organ transplantation, it was really a local endeavor. Organ donation and transplantation involved the transplant team and some form of generally hospital-based organ procurement group, for lack of a better term. Sharing of organs between hospitals was really informal and completely voluntary, and there was no government involvement between the first successful kidney transplant in the United States in 1954 until 1968 with the passing of the Uniform Anatomical Gift Act, which created the first governmental foundation for and regulation of organ donation. So things went along for another 15 years or so, and then in the early 1980s, organ donation and transplantation was really at a crossroads. There was critical organ shortage, inefficient organ matching and placement, and concern that local control of organs led to inequity of donor organ allocation. So in 1984, U.S. Congress passed the National Organ Transplant Act, or NOTA, and NOTA established the Organ Procurement and Transplantation Network, or OPTN, to maintain both a national registry for organ matching, as well as to make policy for how organs should be allocated in the United States. The OPTN is not its own organization per se, so UNOS was awarded the contract in 1986 to fulfill the actions of the OPTN. As most of us on this call know, early lung allocation was based on waiting time alone, which was quite problematic. So in the late 1990s, early 2000s, there started to be efforts toward developing what ultimately became the lung allocation score, or the LAS. And the intent was to balance medical urgency with expected transplant benefit. And so the lung allocation score, or LAS, was implemented in May of 2005. And this comprised a waitlist mortality component and a predicted post-transplant survival component. Despite this, however, carefully constructed score encompassing many factors, geography continued to play a significant role, but this then started to change in 2017. And so a major part of early lung and all organ allocation in the United States was geography, with the donation service area being the first unit of allocation. So for a brief geography lesson for any non-US viewers, this is obviously a map of the United States with the white lines indicating the states and the small boxes all being counties within the states. The colored areas are the geographic boundaries of the donation service areas, or DSAs. So the historical formation of DSAs, while seemingly arbitrary from a geographic standpoint, arose from those relationships I mentioned, developed from the groups that would ultimately become the organ procurement organizations and the surrounding local donor hospitals. But when we look at these boundaries as a whole, we can obviously see how very arbitrary they were. And so as an example, I'm up here in the Pacific Northwest in Seattle. My donation service area is this pink area, which also includes Alaska. But you can see that not all of the counties in Washington state are included in our donation service area. I think a good example and then of how this organ allocation system worked is that organs that are available within a donation service area, so let's say there was an organ available in Montana, it would have to be allocated to all transplant centers within that donation service area, or all areas in pink, before it could then be opened up to any outside geographic areas. And so Texas here down in the bottom is a good example of how problematic this was. And you can see that this area of yellow is one donation service area, but there's several disconnected areas. And this purple is a good example of there being lots of disconnected areas. So again, if an organ became available in one of these purple areas, it would first have to be allocated to all of the transplant centers within this purple area before it could then be opened up to the yellow area or the pink area, which could be geographically closer. And so subsequently in 2017, a lawsuit that originated out of the Northeast successfully argued that the use of donation service areas resulted in the allocation of donor lungs primarily based on a candidate's place of residence instead of by medical urgency or other factors that were included in the lung allocation score. And this is not allowed under the final rule, which I'll discuss in the next slide. And so the lawsuit was very accurate. In previous work done by Dr. Valapur, who you'll hear from later, geography was effectively the most important factor in organ allocation, much more important than the other factors that went into calculation of the LAS. So as things were evolving following the passage of NOTA and the creation of the OPTN in 2000, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services implemented the final rule, which created the regulatory framework for the structure and operations of the OPTN, including specifically guidance around policy development. Importantly, the final rule requires that the OPTN develop policies for the equitable allocation of deceased donor organs that, among other conditions that I haven't listed here, but these are the ones that are most pertinent to our discussion, shall be based on sound medical judgment, shall seek to achieve the best use of donated organs, shall be designed to avoid wasting organs, avoid futile transplants, promote patient access to transplant, and promote the efficient management of the organ placement, but also shall not be based on the candidate's place of residence or place of listing, with the exception of the extent required to achieve the other conditions above. So in response to the lawsuit that highlighted this major failing in organ allocation policies, given that geography was the major deciding factor in how organs were allocated in the US, the OPTN Board of Directors convened a geography committee to establish the principles and a framework to guide how OPTN policies may consider the appropriate use of, but not arbitrary use of, geographic constraints in organ allocation. And as I pointed out with the final rule, geography can be considered as it pertains to, say, sound medical judgment, considering ischemic times, for example, determining the best use of donated organs, and even in promoting the efficient management of organ placement. Ultimately, the committee recommended organ distribution without geographic boundaries, organ allocation as geographically broad as possible, and that geographic constraints must be rationally determined and consistently applied. And this is what ultimately became known as continuous distribution. Sometimes I think we use the terms continuous distribution interchangeably with CS, and I think it's just important to note that continuous distribution is the framework and CAS is the end result organ allocation system specifically for lung. I wanted to make one comment on this graphic here. So the paper utilized this visualization of how geography might be able to be used in an allocation system. This was not designed to actually be an allocation system, but just to give you that visualization. And so this is an example of liver transplant utilizing geography and the MELD score, which is the score of medical acuity. And you can see how candidate B here has a MELD that is higher that then could supersede a candidate with a MELD of 18 who may actually be closer to the donor hospital. But you can also imagine how this candidate B with a MELD of 35, if they were out all the way at 6,000 nautical miles, even a MELD of 35 wouldn't necessarily overcome this geographic distance to supersede candidates who are closer. So now I'm going to switch gears and discuss how organ allocation policy development works in the United States. And so I think this will provide an important framework for the discussion about the current allocation changes that will be reviewed by Dr. Hartwig. So we first need to start with, well, who is the OPTN? Well, the OPTN is effectively everyone impacted by organ donation and transplantation in the United States. And so this is directly from the management and membership policy of the OPTN, which outlines that OPTN members are transplant hospitals, OPO members, histocompatibility labs, medical scientific members, public organization members such as the ISHLT, business members, and individual members. And the folks that fall under individual members can be anyone and everyone, including lung candidates, lung recipients, and, well, I guess any organ candidate or recipient, and donor families, etc. So the OPTN governance structure is seen here. The OPTN is overseen by the OPTN Board of Directors, and there are several committees of the Board of Directors as seen in the orange box up here. And then there are several operating committees that you can see in the lower part of the graphic here, which includes the OPTN Policy Oversight Committee that oversees all policy development across the organization, the OPTN MPSC, or Membership and Professional Standards Committee, which oversees compliance with regulatory aspects of OPTN members. And then this blue box over here, you can see the OPTN Policy Governance Committees, which includes all of the organ-specific committees like the Lung Transplantation Committee, of which Dr. Hartwig is the current chair. And all of these committees make policy proposals as per their area of expertise, oftentimes working together, of course, as it is relevant. So here's a pictorial of the policy development process under the OPTN. If you start up at the top, there are ideas that are developed. There is some amount of analysis of the problem, and then there is an early project approval, because it's important that the OPTN balance the need for the work along with the strategic priorities and budgetary constraints. And then if the project is approved, it moves on to evidence gathering and actual development of a policy proposal. After a policy proposal is created, then it can go out for public comment. And public comment is really a critical component of policy development in the United States. Anyone can comment. In this standard policy development process, public comment is prospective, meaning that the policy has not yet been implemented. And so once public comment comes back, the sponsoring committee can make either minor modifications, major modifications, or sometimes even needs to go back to the drawing board and create a new policy proposal. And public comment is standardized in this process at 45 days. There's also outlining for the need of a document that outlines what the proposed policy is, what it does, data that were reviewed in developing the proposed policy, and how the committee came to the solution that they did. Now, there is an option for an emergency action policy process for those things that need to be addressed more quickly than the standard process can accommodate. And it does need to meet one of the criteria that are listed up here at the top, which is like a proposal that is necessitated by a pending statutory or regulatory change. So the lawsuit in 2017, where a judge said this is not okay, that needed to be changed immediately. And so this fell into an emergency action policy. Similarly, policy proposals that are due to emergent public health issues, like when we were faced with the beginning of COVID-19, we had several emergency action policies when we were all just trying to figure out how to keep transplanting during this time. Of course, any patient safety factors, and then any new medical device or technology that affects how organs are allocated and needs to be addressed immediately. I do think it's important to note that emergency action policies are not intended to be permanent, and they do expire 12 months after the effective date, the date of approval. And that if the policy is intended to become a permanent change, it does then follow the standard policy development process. And the emergency action policy, because these are things that need to be addressed more quickly, does allow for a retrospective public comment, meaning that the policy goes into effect and then a public comment period can happen. It does need to happen within 6 months of approval, and it can be shortened if need be to 30 days, again, to try to speed up the whole process. So now I'm briefly going to talk about the future of lung CAS, as it was included in the title of my talk, and I just wanted to take a few minutes to give you some of my own thoughts. So I want to start by highlighting that the development of the lung composite allocation score was really unique and that the public was integrally involved in the development throughout the entire process of it. Once it was decided which factors would go into the lung composite allocation score, the community was engaged with an exercise of what's called analytic hierarchy process, or AHP. And AHP is an established business technique for decision making in complex environments in which many variables or criteria are considered for prioritization. The AHP exercise utilized for lung asked the participants compare the different attributes, state which they felt was more important, if at all, and then if so, how much more important. And so these are the results that we received from the community at the time, expressing the desired weighting of the different factors. And you'll see it's actually pretty close to what was ultimately chosen for the final proposal. The changes to the weighting were further informed by modeling, of course. And I think the biggest change is that prior living donor was not given 12%, it was given 5%. The additional points were added to waitlist survival and post-transplant outcomes. But you can see that even at this time, the community overall felt that while geography should be considered, it should have a relatively low weighting at 10%. And so this was the final breakdown. I'm not going to walk through all of this, but I just wanted to give you a visualization. And this is, of course, before the change that Dr. Hartwig will discuss. But you can see how the different points break down. You can see that under candidate biology, CPRA and height were added, which were not under lung allocation score. And then, of course, this placement efficiency that's added once donor lungs are actually available. It's the distance between the donor hospital and the transplant hospital. And again, I'm not going to walk through the actual points, but just to give you a visualization for especially those non-US listeners, it just gives you an idea of how the different categories add up to create the overall score, which then is how lungs are allocated. So lastly, I'm going to get a little bit onto my own soapbox of what I think of the future of the lung composite allocation score. You know, we know that the lung CAS is definitely not perfect, and we've learned a lot since its implementation. But it was definitely a start, and it was a necessary move away from geography as the primary driver of organ allocation. The points that I'm going to talk about here are completely my own personal opinion, but are informed by my time working on the development of the allocation system, as well as being an end user, if you will. So I think first, we've learned a lot about the biologic disadvantages and how the CPRA, height, and blood type in the current system are additive, but in actuality, they probably have more of a multiplicative effect in terms of how they impact the effective donor pool for these candidates who may be short, blood type O, and sensitized. Dr. Valapur has done a lot of really great work in this area, and I think it's something that we need to be thinking about further in the future. Similarly, I personally think that we need to readdress medical urgency. I think the slope of the curve that we chose is a very steep curve, with the idea at the time being that as patients got more sick, we really wanted to give them a lot more points, which would then differentiate them from the remainder of the candidates. But I think now, looking back on it and having experienced it as a transplant professional, I personally think that that slope may be a little too steep, and because most candidates actually kind of congregate along the flat part of the curve, which then doesn't allow for differentiation of the vast majority of the candidates. In addition, we've actually allotted quite few points for candidates who are along that flat part of the curve, oftentimes being less than 1, if not even less than 0.5 points. And then lastly, I do think that there are inefficiencies in the system that need to be addressed, and I think that this leads to some of the problems that we've seen overall. But I think that, in my opinion, if inefficiencies in the system should be addressed separately from what we would ideally have as our allocation system. The most important thing in my mind is that we get the right organ to the right patient, even if that patient is 30 miles away or 3,000 miles away. And right now, I think that there are a lot of inefficiencies in how we are transplanting and procuring organs. And so one idea, I don't know that it's the right idea, but one idea is something like a nationalization of the organ procurement and transplantation system, so that transplant centers and OPOs aren't having to reinvent the wheel to do that with every organ. So those are my thoughts. So in conclusion, the U.S. allocation system has a long, complicated history that really does inform where we are today. The OPTN creates the structure and the framework of organ allocation policy development that is by and for the community that it serves. Policy development is structured in a way to create a systematic process, involve all the important stakeholders. And then lastly, I think over time, we can continue to improve and optimize the Lung CAS as we go forward. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Erika. Excellent presentation. As Julia mentioned, I am John Reynolds. I'm the medical director of the Duke University Lung Transplant Program. I also would like to thank ISHLT for putting this timely webinar together, given the importance of the issues we're facing. Moving on, I want to move through the speakers. Moving on, our next speaker is Dr. Matt Hartwig. Matt is a colleague here at Duke University, where he serves as professor of surgery, vice chair of clinical research and data science, and is the current chair of the OPTN Lung Committee. Matt will be reviewing the details of the CAS policy change. Matt, thanks for speaking to us today.
Thank you, John. Get my video here. Can you see my slides, John?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for the introduction, and thank you to the ISHLT for hosting this webinar. I really see it as an opportunity to try and increase communication at this time between the OPTN and the lung community. So let's talk first about allocation out of sequence, which sounds a little bit strange because the talk is really about allocation system. But AOOS, or allocation out of sequence, is really what drove this recent change in policy that occurred. And so I think we need to talk about it for just a minute. The U.S. requires a fair, transparent, equitable, and effective policy for organ allocation. And AOOS occurs when a donated organ is allocated to a candidate outside that of the normal match run. And it's considered a vital strategy to maximize organ utilization. No allocation policy is capable of perfect allocation in every complex donor scenario. And so at its core, allocation out of sequence allows the system the flexibility to facilitate organ placement in unusual circumstances. So these are data that are provided by our colleagues at HRSA. And these are data describing the allocation out of sequence rates over the last few years. And it's a little complicated, so let me just walk through everyone through this for a second. What you can see in the thick black line is the overall percentage of organs in the US that are allocated out of sequence. And we can see historically that it was quite low, at less than 5% until around 2021, when it began to climb rapidly. Now, this increase in AOOS is primarily driven by kidney and liver allocation. You see the top two lines here, sort of a brown and army green colors that are above the black line. But you can also see where the red arrow at, the purple line is the us and the lung community. And you can see prior to the implementation of CAS, it was relatively stable around 4%. And then after CAS, it increases to about 10 to 12%. And, CD, or continuous distribution, or CAS, was implemented around this time. And you can see that temporally, at least, there was a noticeable increase in allocation out of sequence. Now, also, I think interestingly is that once we as a community and the OPTN began to focus on this increase in allocation out of sequence in 2025, you can see a precipitous drop in allocation out of sequence. back down to levels that approximate where they were, at least in lung, from before we went into continuous distribution. And that's prior to any changes to the allocation system. In addition to CAS, there were many changes occurring concomitantly, including, I think importantly, the implementation of new OPO metrics and concerns over decertification of these organ procurement organizations around this time. And you can see shortly after the implementation of new OPO metrics, also temporally speaking, the black line increases quite dramatically and is associated with these new OPO metrics. We've also had an explosion in procurement technologies, perfusion systems, NRP, DCD, et cetera, and all of them have been described to be associated with allocation out of sequence. So the newly seated OPTN board last year asked the Lung Transplant Committee to make recommendations for changing the lung allocation system with the purpose of reducing AOOS. And as Dr. Lease mentioned, we do have some precedents for the need to change allocation emergently. For example, there was the lawsuit brought against the federal government that removed donor service areas as the geographic allocation unit. And then, more recently, shortly after the implementation of the CAS, it was noted that through an error in modeling that the blood type O candidates were disadvantaged. And so within a few months of CAS implementation, the OPTN board emergently changed the CAS point systems at the recommendation of the Lung Committee. Now, this particular and newer request we thought was quite difficult for the committee to address because we don't really have great data to say what drives allocation out of sequence, and we don't really have a quality method of modeling it currently. We do have some published data on AOS, and this is a JAMA surgery paper by Dr. Halpern and all, where she demonstrated that lungs donated out of sequence appeared to be more difficult to place. I think the important thing about this slide is that the donors that were being placed out of sequence were more likely to have lower PF ratios and were more likely to come from DCD donors. So we also had some unpublished data to work with. These are data provided by HRSA that suggested that increasing logistical complexity may play a role. Now, when I say logistical complexity, you won't really know what that is, but we assume that the more transplant centers that the OPOs have to interact with while they work through a match run, then that will increase the logistical complexity. And here we can see that when the number of distinct transplant centers in the early part of the match run in the first 25 sequences increases, that AOOS also increases. And this is especially true if there are 15 or more distinct centers within the top 25 sequences. And here we can see that following the implementation of CAS, there is and there has been a dramatic increase in the number of transplant centers that have to decline an organ prior to acceptance. And again, this may provide a possible surrogate for logistical complexity, which then may provide a way to mitigate allocation out of sequence. So the working hypothesis was that although CAS was associated with some very positive outcomes, such as reducing waitlist mortality and increasing access for disadvantaged candidates, that a necessary side effect of broader sharing is increased logistical complexity, and that this contributes at least in part to out-of-sequence allocation. So subsequently, in developing a policy change, the committee was seeking to find a balance between reducing the complexity by reducing the number of centers in the top of the match run, while also wanting to minimize any unwanted impacts on, for example, increasing the waitlist mortality or reducing access for many of our patients. So as a reminder, the most direct way to reduce distance traveled and therefore the number of centers in the top of the match run is to manipulate those placement efficiency points that Dr. Lease talked about, which were set at 10 or 10% in the initial implementation of CAS. So within the abbreviated time provided to the committee, only a limited number of modifications to the placement efficiency score were possible to examine. So there are really two ways to manipulate the placement efficiency attribute. And the one way is by changing the actual number. So the number is 10% or 10 out of 100. And we can change that number lower or higher to place more or less efficient points on placement efficiency or geography. And the analogy I would use for this is a car. If you change the color of the car, say from red to blue, it's very noticeable, and it obviously changes the car. And that's the sort of similar to changing these absolute points allotted to the attribute. But there's also a way to change the car without everyone noticing, right? You can change out the engine potentially to increase or decrease the performance. And that's the second way that we can change placement efficiency. And we refer to that in this allocation schema as a rating scale, right? So how are those points, how are those 10 points distributed depending on the distance between donor and recipient? And so what we were able to do was look at 3 new distinct rating scales within placement efficiency. And we looked at those 3 rating scales from if you changed the overall score from 0 to 100, right? And remember, it's at 10 now. And we can do that, and then we can simulate the expected impact on things such as waitlist mortality, distance traveled, number of centers in match runs, et cetera. So because, again, limitations of time, we really could only focus on this one, relatively small change in the overall score or allocation system. And we weren't really able to dig into altering other things such as the medical urgency rating scales, which may, have provided some additional refinement. So this is what I mean by modifying the rating scale. So what you can see here on the left, you have the two smaller graphs are the current rating scales, or what were the current rating scales. The 10 placement efficiency points were actually split into two sets of 5 points, and each 5 points had a slightly different rating scale, which we see here. And one is fairly linear and the other one is more curvilinear. And the shape of those curves can dramatically impact the impact of geography on allocation. Now, for the purpose of these simulations and for the intended allocation change, we actually combined the 2 rating scales into one. And you can see that example on the right. So you can see this is one of the 3 rating scales that we looked at that had a relatively high preference for local donors within 400 nautical miles, but then a very steep drop off between 400 to 1,000, and then it leveled off again. So this rating scale would be applied to the entire points that would be allocated to placement efficiency. Now, I don't have time to go into all of the details of all the analyses that we did, but I'd like to give you an example of what this looks like. This is a graph that shows the relationship between the number of points in placement efficiency and then how it relates to waitlist mortality for our patients. Okay, so on the left, you can see waitlist mortality rates, basically. And then on the bottom, as you go across, it's increasing from 0 to 100, the number of points in placement efficiency. Over on the left is what was the current situation, where you can see 10 points being allocated and an expected waitlist mortality of 11.61 under the rating scales that were present. And so using one of the 3 new rating scales, we can see in this sort of the larger graph on the right, what happens if we increase, for example, the points from 10 to 15. You can see that the expected rating scale goes from 11.61 to 11.81, and this was not statistically significant. And so this was felt to be a reasonable spot to try to increase the placement efficiency number 2 under this current rating, or under this new proposed rating scale, without dramatically impacting waitlist survival. So in this graph, we're actually looking at the number of centers in the first 25 sequence numbers. And what we can see is that the same increase to 15% on the placement efficiency using rating scale number 2 reduces the median number of centers from 16 in what was the current system to 14 or less, with 75% of the centers being under this threshold of 15 to 16 centers. And this may seem like a relatively modest change, but we were hopeful that this would be impactful based on the previous data we saw, suggesting that over 15 seemed to be an important threshold. And frankly, it was hard to reduce the number of centers in that top 25 sequence without dramatically increasing the placement efficiency total points and significantly impacting waitlist survival and access. So here are similar results for distance traveled. A lot of people felt that distance traveled would also be potentially a surrogate for logistical complexity. And we can see under the initial CAS rating scale at 10 points, average distance traveled of about 440 nautical miles. With increasing the score to 15 in the new rating scale, that expected median travel distance would be down to 320 nautical miles. And now let's briefly look at some of the sort of at-risk groups that we think people and candidates who would have a difficult time potentially accessing organs and how these changes would impact them. This is an example using the ABO blood group types. And you can see that both in the previous version of CAS as well as in the newly implemented version, that the ABO-Os at the bottom have the lowest transplant rate of all the blood groups. But we can also appreciate that using the new rating scale and increasing from 10 to 15 would not expect to noticeably impact the access for our ABO-O candidates. Here we see a similar analysis. This is for our by stature. So the shorter patients, the shorter candidates have a harder time accessing lungs. And you can see in the blue line, the smallest recipients at less than 5'2", and sort of the yellow line above that would be 5'2" to 5'5". Apologies for those on the metric system. I can't do the conversions to centimeters, but they're on the screen for you. But the point is, you can see again, looking at the impact of these changes in or on these candidates by stratification of their height. And you can see that there actually would be likely a small decrease and noticeable decrease in access for our shortest stature patients, but relatively stable access for others. And similar to blood group O and similar to the heights, we can now look at pediatrics as well. And we can see that with the new rating scale, we can increase from about 10 to 15 points and not expect to see a dramatic difference in the transplant rates for our pediatric patients. So this is what it's sort of the typical analysis that we had access to at the time to make decisions and how the committee came to their conclusions. In the end, the committee recommended to the board no change to the placement efficiency at this time, pending continued monitoring the trends in allocation out of sequence, as well as awaiting the result of an OPTN-wide allocation out of sequence working group that was included all the organs and was actively looking into drivers and ways to mitigate out of sequence. The committee also had concerns around unknown potential impacts of change on lung allocation out of sequence and how they may negatively impact our patients, either through waitlist survival or access, particularly for those who are the hardest to match. So the committee did suggest that if a change was felt to be, or the board felt compelled to make a change, they recommended one of the new rating scales that appeared to be the most functional and least harmful, and increasing the points from 10 to 15. And so that is how we get the latest iteration of CAS with an increase in those placement efficiency points to 15, but again, also a significant change in the rating scale underlying those 15 points and how they're attributed to our candidates. And this did go into effect approximately 1 month ago. So to conclude, I mean, I think it's pretty clear how important public policy is and how it can dramatically impact the organ donation process and the well-being of our patients. And it should really be done thoughtfully and in a data-driven manner. That the impact of the recent changes remain to be determined as we were only 1 month into this process. I think we've demonstrated now multiple times that continuous distribution and the CAS score could be considered a modern allocation system. It certainly seems to allow for greater flexibility and efficiencies and tweaks to the system, both in the analysis phase of things as well as in the implementation phase of things. And then finally, the optimal allocation system is obviously going to need to balance multiple factors of the final rule that Dr. Lease talked about. Ultimately, we're all working towards the same goals. Unfortunately, some of those goals or none of the goals are really fully independent. And so we're always having to balance weighting one goal potentially over another. So thanks very much for your attention and looking forward to the rest of the webinar.
Thank you so much, Matt, for that summary of what's was reviewed by the Thoracic Board. We're fortunate that our next speaker is Miriam Valapur. She's the Director of Lung Transplant Outcomes at the Cleveland Clinic. She's also a senior staff member for lung transplant at the SRTR, where she oversees the National Transplant Outcome Analyses and refinement of the U.S. Lung Transplant Allocation System. I would note that she's also an advisor to the OPTN board. She's an NIH-funded investigator who has spent the last 20 years focusing on improving lung U.S. organ allocation systems, and she's been analyzing for the last 2 decades the outcome of allocation strategies and how these affect patient survival. So we are looking forward to the recent data that Miriam and her group have analyzed with the CAS system, as well as the effects that these changes in continuous distribution have on patients and patient survival. Miriam?
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask Olivia to see if she can bring my video up. I seem to not be able to do that. So I'll just go ahead and get started. Start my video. Let's see. I'm going to see if I can bring my face up. It might help make the information more digestible. Can everyone see my slides okay?
We can see you and your face.
Wonderful. So thank you so much for the kind introduction and for the invitation to present today. I wanted to talk about the proposed CAS modification and how it increases the influence of geographic proximity within the lung allocation system. Over the next 15 minutes or so, I'm going to talk about the potential geographic consequences of that change. Distance between the donor hospital and the candidate transplant center was already part of the CAS calculation, but its importance has increased significantly, as Matt has mentioned. Just a quick reminder of what changed using some visuals here. Let me orient you to the figure. The x-axis shows a candidate's distance from the donor. The y-axis shows the number of geographic efficiency points a candidate receives. Under the original CAS, candidates closer to the donor received more points, and those points declined gradually as distance between the candidate and the donor increased. The May 7th modification increased the influence of distance in 2 ways. First, the rate of decline in points became much steeper. To give you a sense of the magnitude, under the original CAS, a candidate 500 miles away from a donor received about 83% of the points available, and a candidate 1,000 miles away would receive about 72% of the points. Under the modified CAS, those same candidates now receive 75% and much lower, 25% of the points. So the farther a candidate is from a donor, the larger the penalty they now receive in this geographic efficiency component of the CAS. And the second way this amendment works is that geographic efficiency also now contributes a larger proportion of the overall CAS. The rationale for this change was the growing inefficiency of the allocation system. Since its implementation, procurement travel distances have increased, and with that has come greater operational complexity. The lung transplant centers have been trying to innovate around that, but I think it's important to acknowledge that these are real challenges. My task today is not to propose nuanced fixes to those challenges. Rather, is to discuss the question that arises around this particular proposed fix, which is what are the geographic consequences of increasing the influence of distance? When we think about geography and organ allocation, we often think about distance. Distance tells us about proximity, but geography has another dimension as well, donor supply, and that tells us about availability. The figure that I'm showing you here shows the geographic distribution of deceased donor lungs across the United States. The dark blue regions represent areas with higher donor density or donor supply, and the lighter regions represent areas with lower donor density. The black dots represent individual donor hospitals that yielded at least one lung donor over the 1.5 years of the CAS period. What I hope you notice here is that these differences are not subtle. We're not seeing small fluctuations around a national average. We're seeing distinct donor environments across the country. And what really strikes me when I look at this map is that we don't have one donor environment in the United States. We have many donor environments. Some parts of the country have substantially more donor lungs available than others. And if donor supply varies geographically, donor opportunity, that is a candidate's opportunity to receive an offer, may also differ geographically as well. Which led us to ask the next question, which is whether donor environment influences donor opportunity. To answer that question, we estimated donor opportunity for candidates listed at lung transplant centers across the United States. We define donor opportunity as the number of potential donors available to a candidate after we account for distance. In other words, we're not just counting donors, we're estimating the opportunities a candidate has in action and is likely to have access to under the geographic weighting of the system. Let me orient you to this figure. Each diamond in the figure, it represents a lung transplant center. The larger diamonds represent centers with larger waiting lists. The color reflects donor opportunity per candidate. Darker colors indicate greater number of donors, and the lighter colors indicate lower number of donors. What I want you to notice here is that these patterns are not randomly distributed, even under the prior iteration of the CAS, which is what I'm showing you here. There are regions in the country where donor opportunity is consistently higher, and there are donor areas where donor opportunity is consistently lower. Even within the continuous distribution framework, donor opportunity is not uniform. Candidates listed in different donor environments experience very different levels of opportunity. I'll admit when I looked at this figure first, it really surprised me. Like many people in transplantation, I've spent years thinking of geography primarily through the lens of distance. But when we mapped out donor opportunity this way, it became clear that donor environment was shaping opportunity in ways I had not fully appreciated to this point. So the answer to that question appears to be yes, donor environment does shape donor opportunity. And the next question was, what happens when distance received greater weight, as it happened with this policy? So on the top, it is the donor opportunity under the prior CAS that we just looked at together. At the bottom is the opportunity under the amended policy. I don't expect you to compare every transplant center between the two maps. Instead, focus on the overall pattern. Importantly, donor supply has not changed. Donor environment has not changed. Our candidates have not changed. What has changed is the policy. And what changed was the influence of distance. And when distance received greater weight, donor opportunity changed with it. Some regions gained and some regions lost. And the key point that we started out with was that different donor environments around the country, and when the allocation system changed, it changes donor opportunity across the country. But one question remained after this was that could these differences simply reflect differences in patients being listed at different transplant centers? To address that question, we adjusted for candidate and transplant center characteristics, including the number of candidates listed at each of these centers, candidates' biological characteristics that impact donor offers, including height and ABO blood type. This figure is organized exactly like the previous figures. Each diamond represents a transplant center. The colors reflect adjusted donor opportunity per candidate at the centers. So if the patterns we observed in the previous figures were primarily explained by differences in candidate characteristics, we would expect basically much of the variation to disappear. But that's not what happened. The map looks remarkably similar to what we saw before. The exact values changed, but the overall geographic patterns remained. Despite adjustment, substantial geographic variation persisted. This suggests that donor environment itself contributes to donor environment. And for me, that was an important finding because it suggests that distance tells part of the geographic story, but donor supply tells another. These observations that I've shared with you are not merely theoretical observation, they translate into changes in candidate prioritization. This table compares candidate rankings under the prior and the amended policy. And what stands out is that 70% of candidates who were ranked in the top 10 under the previous CAS remained in the top 10 under the amended CAS, which means that a quarter of the candidates who were ranked in the top 10 dropped to a lower rank under the amended policy. That's a surprisingly large number, especially when you consider that the candidates did not change, the donor environment didn't change. The only thing that changed was how distance was weighted. Now, that doesn't mean these candidates will not receive a transplant. It doesn't mean they won't receive an offer. But what it does mean is that their position in the allocation system changes. And that's important because prioritization is ultimately how allocation policy affects patients. And roughly half of our lung transplant patients, half of our transplants happen for the candidates ranked in the top 10. So if you're in the top 10, you're more likely to receive an offer. And of course, these effects are not distributed equally among candidates. Let me orient you to this figure. So this figure shows change in candidate prioritization by blood type associated with the amended policy. If someone moves to the right of the vertical line, they are receiving more priority under the new system. And if they're going to the left, that means they receive lower priority. Most candidates receive relatively modest changes, which is reassuring. For many candidates, the proposed modification had relatively little effect based on their blood type. But that's not the whole story. The tails of the distribution, we can see that these candidates whose prioritization changes substantially, and those are not randomly distributed. In this example, many of the candidates are blood type O. Just about everyone who's deprioritized based on blood type is type O. The important point here is that the consequences of the policy are not experienced equally across candidates, and it just so happens that blood type O are most dependent on broader sharing for their organ offers. So up to this point, we've seen effects of the policy, and we've seen the increasing influence of distance changes donor opportunity, and we've seen that it also changes candidate prioritization. This figure, I think, helps us understand the mechanism behind that. The red star marks a donor in New York. The colors show the level of medical urgency a candidate would need. to achieve the same priority for that donor. Blue regions represent candidates who could achieve that priority with less medical urgency, and as the colors shift towards red, candidates would need increasingly greater medical urgency to achieve the same priority. Now, it's important to recognize that distance has always been part of the allocation system. Even under the prior CAS, which is on the top figure, candidates farther from a donor generally needed to be somewhat sicker to achieve the same priority as those who were closer. But what changed under the amended policy is the magnitude of that difference that you can see in the bottom map. As you move farther from the donor, candidates now must be substantially sicker to achieve the same priority. That is the intended effect of increasing the influence of distance, and this figure helps us see how that change is being incorporated into prioritization. You may be thinking, does this pattern depend on where a donor is located? And the answer to that is it doesn't. This figure shows the same analysis for a donor located in the middle of the country. The details change, but the underlying relationship remains the same. As distance becomes more influential, candidates farther from the donor require increasingly greater medical urgency to achieve the same priority. So this is not simply a feature of one donor location. It reflects the broader way distance is incorporated into the allocation system. At the beginning of this talk, I suggested that geography has at least two dimensions. Distance tells us about proximity, donor supply tells us about availability. We've explored both, and I think what's become clear is that they're not interchangeable. They capture different aspects of geography, and they reveal different consequences. Distance helps us understand efficiency. Donor supply helps us understand access. And I think if we focus only on one, we risk missing the other. I like to finish where we started. When I first looked at this map, I saw variation in donor supply. What I didn't yet appreciate was how much those differences would matter when distance became more important. Now we know that donor supply is not distributed evenly across the country. And we've seen that when the influence of distance changes, those differences really matter. For me, that was probably the most important insight from this work. We simply cannot apply a uniform distance rule to non-uniform donor environments and expect uniform consequences. Before I close, I'd like to acknowledge an extraordinary team here. Over the past 7 years, we've worked together to study how allocation policy translates into the experience of transplant candidates and recipients. And this work really reflects the efforts of many people shown here, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to work with them. And finally, for references, the 3 papers I used for this presentation can be accessed using the first QR code. The second will take you to codes we use for simulating different allocation rules, and hopefully soon there will be an app there for those of us who are not adept at performing complex statistical analyses. And my contact information is there for you to reach me. And again, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Miriam, for that very interesting presentation and the data. I'd like to invite the viewers to enter into the chat questions that you have for our panelists. We will have, at the end of the presentations, time for Q&A. So please enter questions that you have from these presentations into the chat. Our next speaker is Dr. Ari Holm. Ari is a professor of medicine, senior consultant and respiratory specialist, and department head at the University of Oslo in Norway. Ari previously served on the ISHLT Board of Directors and is chair of the ISHLT Ethics Committee until 2023. and has been the chair of the ISHLT Membership Oversight Committee since 2025. Ari will be speaking on the European perspective of the composite allocation system. Welcome, Ari.
Thank you. Thank you so much, John. And thank you for the invitation to give this talk, which is going to be about a European perspective on the American lung allocation system. And as you can see on this picture, I think it's a mixture of bewilderment and awe. It was truly impressive talks we had from the previous speakers, and I will try to give some thoughts from this side of the Atlantic. And the first thing I want to do is just share some general thoughts about inequity, because all of the talks we have heard, I think, reflect on a very strong will to achieve fairness. Fairness is the opposite of inequity. So I want to start with some general thoughts about that, since we are dealing with a rationing of organs. And then specifically, I want to say a few general words about geography, similar to what Mariam did. After that, I will, as best as I can, say something about the European systems and how exceptions are treated in European systems. A few words about governance on this side and your side of the Atlantic. And finally, just a little note on changing technology and geography, what that might mean. So the first thoughts that came to me on this subject is that we are trying to save lives. We are rationing life years. That's what we're doing. And no matter how we do it, no matter how we allocate, there will be people who die because we don't have enough for all. And this is sort of the path. If you're American, you're into baseball, and these are the bases you have to go through. First, you have to have access to good pulmonary care, and then you have to be referred to a transplant center, and then you have to get on the wait list, and you have to wait for a donation. As Mariam showed, the access to donated organs varies a lot within the US. And then there's the allocation whenever the donor becomes available. And then there are differences, of course, in surgery performed, post-operative care management, and post-operative follow-up. We see there are great differences in long-term survival after lung transplant between centers. So all of these bases you have to come through. And where are the inequities? Are they in the access to healthcare, insurance, citizenship maybe, or residence where you live? Are they medical? The rate of urgency or the sum of urgency and the prospects of survival, or maybe the life years lived, the fair innings, which would give priority to those who have lived the fewest lives, which means younger people. And do we have biological inequities, such as blood group? We heard about that. It's not a good idea to have a blood group that fits everyone else. Size, sex, sensitization. And then there's efficiency. I'm not sure if that is the same, so I put it separate from equity. Distance, placement, efficiency, as you call it, and cost. Does that matter in who gets a lung in the end? So when you look at this list, what is your favorite inequity? Which one do you want to focus on this entire list? And another thing that struck me preparing for this, when you see a list of values or a list of inequities, do you want to create a hierarchy, like a flow chart, or do you try to make a composite, like a big equation with X's and Y's, and equate a blood group inefficiency with, say, distance or insurance or finance, whatever? Is that what you want to do? And today we are choosing this particular situation and this particular inequity to discuss. That's sort of the focus. And it's good, I think, to just be aware that there are a lot of other factors that affect the end result of access to lung transplant. Then a few words about geography. I think it's worth, when we in a minute are going to talk about European systems, to mention the importance of national jurisdictions. Both the WHO and the World Health Assembly have stated that transplantation should meet the needs of a given population using resources from within that population. So this is a great respect for each country needs to be self-sufficient in terms of organ transplant. It's not like that if you have a famine in Africa, everyone feels responsible or should feel responsible to help that. But when there's a donor shortage, there are national borders. And I think the reason these two things are different is that the resource for transplant is human organs that need legal protection. So I think that's why it's internationally recognized that there must be national borders regulating transplant. Then you have the Declaration of Istanbul enforcing this, and the purpose of that is to avoid commercialization and transplant tourism. Again, to avoid making human body parts to commodities or commercial products. So that's worth noticing because most European, if not all European systems, have a great respect for national borders, which is not so much an issue within the US, of course. And then geography means, of course, the obvious, the practical things. How far can you actually travel? How long can you preserve an organ, which is necessary to move it? And how far can you move the recipient? So those are practical implications of geography. Now, a few words about lung allocation in Europe. Most European countries, and at least those in Western Europe, have a comprehensive healthcare coverage, which means good access to healthcare for everyone. And one measure of that is that there is a very low rate of what people call the catastrophic healthcare expenses, which means an event that would cost you more than 10% of household income. That's very rare in most European countries, or at least in the Western European countries. That said, you have a highly varying donation rate and transplant activity between these countries. For lungs, it's, I think, 2 per million inhabitant in the United Kingdom, and it's 6 times as much in Belgium, for instance. There are also highly varying allocation systems. So in the national allocation systems of, for instance, the UK, France, and Spain, you have regional allocation and then super-regional by certain criteria. So again, that would be more of a hierarchical structure for super-regional regional allocation, not a scoring system. In Scaniotransplant, which is the system I know best, we have national allocation, and it's simply clinical discretion because the hospitals know their patients. There's no competition between hospitals for the organs, and I think that's an important point. Then Eurotransplant, which is maybe most comparable to the US, you have national allocation and then supranational if the lung allocation score, which was based and is similar to the previous US system, which is if it exceeds a certain threshold, then you get supranational priority, but below that you have national priority. And specifically in Germany and the Netherlands, even the allocation below that is regulated by the lung allocation score. So that's the allocation, that's the picture in European countries. How are exceptions treated? Like what Matt talked about, the allocation out of sequence, the exceptions from the rule. There is an exception to the lung allocation score in Eurotransplant, but it's rare. In the period from 2011 to 2018, there were only 420 requests, which is 8% of the total volume. And of these, less than a third were actually approved. And then you have another phenomenon. It's the rescue allocation in Eurotransplant. I think you might say it's equivalent to the AOOS. It's defined as having 3 declines or having a particular time constraint in the allocation. Then the organ is allocated to a specific center, not an individual. In the UK and France, if you want to have a special priority, this would require explicit justification and a central review. And in Scaniotransplant, we have a peculiar system where each center gets supranational priority, but it's limited to 3 times per year, which is less than 10% of the volume. but you can pick any one you like at your particular center. So there are no specific criteria for that. And this is compared to for 2024, almost 1 out of 5 organs were allocation out of sequence in the US, as far as the data I've seen. So this is a comparison between exceptions from the system on both sides of the Atlantic. Governance is tricky and difficult. We heard about the system in the United States, and I have to repeat, I think it's impressive that such a vast country with so many competing hospitals and such a complex healthcare environment that you are actually able to establish a national allocation system that regulates this. And it is even revised and evaluated frequently. There are, from a European point of view, there seem to be strong commercial dynamics in the United States, which is different in Europe. It creates a dynamic system, but it's not easy to understand the total effects of that. We heard about the emergency pathway, and Matt told us about how that comes about. It's still a bit hard to understand the total governance of emergency exceptions or pathways. In Europe, you have, as I told you, many systems, a very high variation between the countries. Usually you don't have competing hospitals. I think that's an important point. There is a huge bureaucracy in continental Europe in the Eurotransplant system. Changes are hard to implement. And in my eyes, the rescue allocation is not entirely transparent. It's not entirely clear to me who gets those organs. In scanner transplant, we are very fortunate. It's all clinician driven. We meet up with the authorities once a year in September and have sandwiches, and everyone's happy. But all the decisions and the entire system is designed by clinicians. So that's very different from Eurotransplant. And there is a structural separation between commercial logistics and allocation. The transport and allocation is nationalized, I think, in Europe, as Erika suggested. And there are procedural standards for policy change in Europe too. A few words finally on organ perfusion and preservation, because since we are talking about geography, we all know that the last ISHLT meeting, there were a lot of talks about organ preservation. It has grown over the last years. And it's a good thing. It allows us to have better evaluation of the lungs before we accept it. It increases the possible ex corpus time. I'm not sure it's correct to say ex vivo because the donor isn't alive, but it increases that time, and that obviously facilitates transport. And then there are additionally various transport systems. And all of this costs money. So are we actually looking at a strong trend to commercialize the allocation process? Maybe, and what should the consequence of that be for our regulations and for our allocation systems? That's a question that I think I would just like to put on the table. So I would like to summarize the European perspective by repeating that allocation is just one part of the chain. It's just one base in the whole chain from being a needy patient to getting a transplant. And we need to think about which values our allocation system should address and whether it should be hierarchical or a composite and a scoring system. And then we need to do on our side of the Atlantic as well, as you do, evaluate the system and continuously ask ourselves how well the system works, and also what the drivers of the system might be. How are decisions made? Do we have commercial interests? Do we have emergency pathways? How do they work? What do we do with the rescue allocations? And finally, how will emergent technologies in organ preservation influence all of these systems from now on and into the future? And with those words, I would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ari. Excellent presentation. Our last speaker is Carmel Aronson. Carmel is a lung transplant recipient back in 2015, and she's also a volunteer with the Lung Transplant Foundation. She's not live with us today, but we do have a pre-recorded video from Carmel where she addresses her experience as a lung transplant recipient and who now unfortunately has clad BOSS, and she is back on the transplant waiting list. If we could move on to her video, please.
I'd like to start off by thanking the ISHLT for inviting me here today to speak on behalf of the patient experience and the integral role of patient advocacy in the creation of lung transplant policy. My name is Carmel, and I received a bilateral lung transplant in 2015 due to idiopathic pulmonary arterial hypertension. In 2018, 2 years after my transplant, I was officially diagnosed with CLAD. After about 7 years of relatively low but stable lung function, I qualified again for a repeat bilateral lung transplant, and I've been active on the list for exactly 1 year this week. I also volunteer with the Lung Transplant Foundation, assisting them with the creation of educational webinars that highlight under-discussed topics essential to quality of life for the pre- and post-lung transplant community. You should check them out if you're unfamiliar. So far today, we've heard a lot of very important facts about the recent emergency change to the CAS. I'm now going to shift gears a bit and focus on the feelings of the current moment. Because right now, many lung transplant candidates are terrified, and our feelings have a rightful place within the larger conversation of the impact this change has on the community.
I think we're experiencing some technical difficulties, and while we work on that, perhaps we will jump to the Q&A portion of our program.
7th, we woke up to find that our CAS scores had dropped, even though our need for a life-saving transplant remained just as severe. My CAS score dropped by almost 1.4 points once the new allocation ratios went into effect. But that decrease in points only tells part of the story of how additionally disadvantaged I have become. Given that my transplant center is on the West Coast and the new CAS system employs a steeper curve ratio associated with the same travel distance, I am now significantly less likely to be matched with lungs than I was before this change took effect. To lose ground moving towards a lung transplant, as our lung disease continues to worsen and progress, is a heartbreaking experience for many members of this community, one that we are feeling acutely and en masse right now. One waitlist candidate, whose height is below 5 feet, shared in her public comment, My story is like many others. My husband and I raised our children. We've been caregivers to our parents. I took care of grandkids while my kids worked. I want to do the things my husband and I planned, but at this point, it's hard to just go anywhere. I'm on 6 to 10 liters of oxygen, so it's hard to even go anywhere and have enough tanks. Some days, just the effort to walk through the house and breathe feels like too much to withstand. I can't really say when the last time I really felt good was. I've been on the list for 2 years now. We really thought we'd be on the other side of this by now. Please, consider me in your decision making. And one family member of a lung transplant candidate wrote, "This is very personal to me, since my beautiful and brilliant niece has been on the transplant list for a very long time, awaiting this life-saving surgery. Her chance for living a full life is totally dependent on her standing on the wait list. Taking critical points away from her would make a life-saving difference. My niece has been bravely living with her extremely compromised life and limited breath for too long. She courageously fights this battle every day, and she deserves to maintain her current standing on the list." Many in the community also feel betrayed by HRSA and the OPTN, the governmental institutions that they had previously assumed existed to serve them and look out for their best interests. As they listen to the official explanations being provided, they are keenly aware of the dehumanizing language being employed to justify the potential increase in waitlist mortality and how it will be unequally distributed among geographic regions and recipient medical characteristics. As one caregiver wrote, "I've been involved with the lung transplant community for over 10 years. During these 10 years, I have always felt that the medical community had my wife's best interest in mind, but this is no longer the case. During the OPTN town hall meeting, I watched OPTN board members use language such as, 'This will be a difficult transition.' For whom, I ask? Having my loved one die on the wait list because of your new unfounded policy is not a difficult transition. It is unconscionable, and it is avoidable by using the science that is already available to make informed decisions. My wife's life deserves more than a wait-and-see approach." Others expressed the feeling of being gaslit, as HRSA tells us to ignore what we can see, hear, and read in lieu of their unsubstantiated claims that this change to the CAS is because allocation out of sequence was an emergent problem in the lung transplant community that necessitated an emergency action. Everyone who watched the recording of the November 2025 OPTN board meeting heard a board member share, and I quote, "My broader point is that our colleagues at HRSA have made it clear that we will only unpause continuous distribution work on other organs if we have a policy response to allocation out of sequence in lung. That was one of the things that they sent us in their email. And I think, given our interest in continuing the work on continuous distribution in other organs, it's incumbent on us to consider policy revisions in this space." I would like to encourage you right now to step outside of your own position and imagine hearing that statement as a lung transplant candidate. Because as a lung transplant candidate, you've spent the last weeks, months, or years doing everything that was asked of you. Qualifying for listing likely required you to mobilize every single social, emotional, physical, and financial resource that you have access to. You may have had to have all of your teeth pulled out and replaced by dentures. You may have had to take your children out of school, rehome your pets, and move to a different state. You may have been required to wait out a multi-year period due to a historical cancer diagnosis, defying the survival statistics as your pulmonary disease progressed, and you did it. Every single waking moment of your life, you must consciously, manually override your body's own panic cues, telling you that you are suffocating to death. You went through and continue to go through all of that for the glimmer of a hope that a donor match would appear in time to save your life. And then this is the justification you are given for why your likelihood of passing away on the wait list just increased. How do you think that feels? To quote one transplant caregiver, dealing with a terminal illness, managing hope and expectations while waiting for suitable donations, preparing for a hoped-for life-saving transplant, including financial considerations, all of that is hard enough without also feeling jeopardized by bureaucratic and policy positions that don't put the patient and professional medical expertise first. A similar sentiment was expressed by another caregiver in her public comment. She writes, "I strongly believe in evidence-based decision-making in clinical settings, and this emergency change appears to prioritize logistical convenience over patient outcomes. There is no evidence that deprioritizing patient criteria in favor of administrative ease will save more lives, and it will likely cost them." Like many professional organizations, the lung transplant community is equally disturbed by the policy change and the process that was used to arrive at this change. And despite our reduced pulmonary capacity and lowered exercise tolerance, we are not going to take this change sitting down. Upon learning of this change to the CAS, the Lung Transplant Foundation immediately set up a landing page for community members who wanted to self-educate and participate in patient advocacy efforts. The website defined essential terms, listed a high-level summary of what was at stake, and hosted a 30-minute educational video for individuals who wanted to take a deeper dive. Within the first 24 hours of posting our demo public comment letter and a link to HRSA's comment page, 40 community members had already submitted their public comments. 3 weeks in, and that number has climbed to over 200, and we are still going strong. The longer this new policy stands, the more likely that the theoretical increase in deaths will convert into actual loss of life for ourselves and our loved ones. As the ones whose lives are on the line, we never get a break from this harsh reality. So I'm asking all of you, as you move forward with this discussion, to remember the personal stories that I've shared with you today, not as anecdotes, but as what the data points in your studies more accurately represent. Every single waitlist candidate is a unique human being who is essential to their families and communities, and whose being alive makes a difference in the world. I want to close with one final recipient quote, because I think that it sums up so well what is at stake for us and what we think should be prioritized in allocation policy. This individual wrote, "This matters deeply to me because I am alive today due to a system that prioritized medical urgency. Patients like me are already at an enormous disadvantage because sensitization and antibodies reduce donor compatibility and increase waiting risk. If medical urgency had not remained central to allocation decisions, I may not have survived long enough to receive the organs that ultimately saved my life. Because of that transplant, I am here today celebrating my daughter's 18th birthday and watching her walk across the stage at her high school graduation. I am here for the milestones that my daughter and I almost lost forever. Policies that shift priority away from the sickest and most medically complex patients risk devastating consequences for people like me. While efficiency matters, it should never outweigh survival for critically ill candidates whose circumstances already make transplantation extraordinarily difficult." On behalf of lung transplant candidates, recipients, and community members, I thank you for your time and attention.
I think we can all agree that Carmel's presentation was very powerful. Thank you, Carmel, for that. Being a voice for our patients and your courage. We don't have much time for questions. We'll bring our panelists on and maybe start with Miriam. And I guess a couple of things to get to quickly. And questions kind of go together. First, do you think some of the data that Matt presented about the change decreasing the number of unique programs in the top of the match run fit with the data and the modeling you have and that you presented? And then two, it's a complex aspect, but in terms of a fix, if this change is actually making, depending on geography, where candidates may be, worse in access, what would be some potential changes? Obviously, there isn't one answer to it, but would be incorporating population density in some fashion be an aid to this?
Unpause myself for a minute, unmute myself. I would say, so I was not involved in the analyses that Matt presented, but I can see that as you decrease geographic distance or ability to travel for donor offers, as you get less priority, I can see how that would decrease the number of transplant centers that can buy for that donor offer. So those two could go together. And the next question is about the concept of population density and effective donor supply. It is true that you're likely to have more donors in very dense donor areas. Like I showed, in a lot of those are big metropolitan areas. But access to transplant is dependent on not only the donor supply, right? But also, so the population density, I'm going to say, is not necessarily reflective of access, because access depends on donor supply, where your transplant center is located in relation to that, specific biological variables that individual may inhabit. And allocation policy, right? So it depends on how far you're allowed, if you're allowed to travel the same distance, but you're in a very donor sparse area, that allocation policy really has a different impact on you there if you're in a donor dense area. I hope it answered the question.
Yes, thank you, Miriam.
John, if I could just add to Miriam's comment, maybe. I mean, there are other factors that also go into donor availability and access, and sometimes they're harder to understand and measure. But OPO performance and donor hospital performance can also potentially play a critical role, and we know that some organizations responsible for organ management, can vary by twofold: the ability to get the equivalent type donors properly into the system. And so it is a very complex problem, and clearly geography is the most rudimentary tool that we use to kind of look at that.
Given what we've heard, Matt, I have a question for you and potentially Erika if she wants to comment. If in fact the data that we reviewed suggests that that this change is adversely affecting patients, particularly those in different geographic areas and with biological challenges to find matches. What is the mechanism by which our community can address this in an efficient manner?
Well, I think there's a few things. I mean, obviously, we have to operate under the rubric of the allocation system, and that's going to drive most of what we do. I think, as Erika had mentioned, there are other ways other than the allocation system to enhance and increase efficiencies in the system, and I'm certainly a big proponent of trying to get the right organ to the right patient through other ways, potentially through regionalization of procurement in some form or fashion, enhancing some of the DonorNet functionality, like increasing filters, allowing transplant programs to better filter organs prior to even coming up on the match run to increase efficiencies for the OPOs and for allocation. There's been a recent implementation of a system to try and increase the data that are available to those who are assessing the donors at the time they get the offer, so that the offers can move through much more quickly, because there's a big delay in sort of going from center to center to evaluate an offer. So I think that there's a lot of different ways outside of manipulating the allocation system that we can try and help facilitate placement of organs. I think the other aspect of this is, right now we're in this transition period between vendors for services of the OPTN. And so eventually hopefully we'll have vendors in place, and we'll have the opportunity for the committee work to resume, so that we can also continue some of the work we were doing before this transition period around modifying and enhancing the allocation system to better serve the hard to match candidates. Because I do think there are the CAS that was created and the CAS that we have now are not probably going to be the CAS that we have in 5 years, as we learn more and do more to optimize those underlying attribute scores and rating scales for each attribute.
Thanks, Matt. I guess I was more specifically asking, in the short term, for this change that was implemented on May 6th, is there anything that us or the community should be doing? Or do you feel that these longer term solutions that you've suggested are the best way forward?
Well, I mean, I think we're a little bit limited in our toolkit right now. I mean, one of the things, and Carmel mentioned this in her presentation quite eloquently, is getting on the public comment, which I believe is still open for just a short period of time, and let your thoughts be known if you have them, so that the current board members and HRSA folks can have a chance to see what the public comment is like. If you have concerns or you like the changes, let them know, let the system know, and that's one way to get your feedback.
Thanks, Matt.
I couldn't agree with Matt more. And I first want to take an opportunity to say thank you to Carmel for really eloquently putting the patient perspective front and center, and the reason that all of us do this. And I think it's important to acknowledge their experience. But in terms of the more acute time frame, if you will, I agree with the need for submitting public comment, both from personal as well as your own programmatic experience is really important. And I think that a lesson that I took away from this also is after Dr. Velapor's paper came out in CHEST, showing the data that she showed us on her presentation, is really the importance to doing a very thorough analysis of any proposed changes. I think that there was an attempt to want to an understanding desire to want to move things forward, but I think it just goes to show the importance that we can't think of all the potential unintended consequences of proposed policy changes, and it's really important that in the future for future changes that community members really participate in the discussion so that we can make sure that we do all of the necessary evaluation prior to a proposal becoming policy.
Erika, I completely agree with you, and that's particularly noteworthy to comment on that, like you mentioned, in light of what Andrew, Dr. Courtwright put in the chat about what some of the pressures were regarding implementation. There were some other, any panelists or some other questions in the chat about how has lung utilization been impacted. Eric, I think you had addressed one of the questions about HLA and high allosensitization, that we're not adequately addressing that, and maybe some aspects that you had proposed of like a instead of additive, multiplicative approach. But any comments about lung utilization rate with this change?
Matt might have better access to utilization data. I don't. I have not seen any recent utilization data, although I think just by what's available online at the HRSA site, I haven't seen any changes, but I don't know if there's been any review of data since the change in May.
Yeah, we really don't have any good data around sort of anything that's changed since the new system has been allocated. Like I said, we're just about a month out. There's a little bit of lag time. There's obviously a tremendous amount of variability month to month in what we do. And so even if I did have 30-day data to show, I would question it and its utility. Unfortunately, it's going to be time will tell at this point from the immediate impact on things.
I just wanted to quickly comment. I see the most recent Q&A said that they couldn't see the chat. I think what Dr. Reynolds was referencing is actually a comment made in the Q&A. So I think, can all participants see all of the Q&A? I guess I don't know. And then you can also see a section where some of the Q&A have been answered. There's an answered section for folks who want to take a look at that.
John, we could talk about the CPRA question if that has not been answered.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks, man.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the most complicated way to answer this is we don't know for sure because the CPRA data are not complete within the SRTR data that we get back. So not all programs put all antibodies into the system. Some don't list any at all. And so the data set are incomplete, but there certainly seems to be some improvement for the highly sensitized in the allocation and, CAS, as we gave highly sensitized patients extra points. But the antibodies have to be put into the system in order to get those points. And it's probably not enough. I mean, I think we see that for the O's and we see that for the short-statured patients. And I think you can extrapolate that to the CPRA is that by giving them some additional points in CAS, it has been somewhat beneficial. But if that's a goal of the community, then more work on that needs to be done.
I will say that one of the things that we talked about with the development, or the original development, was trying to get all of the HLA data entered, and then programs could select whether or not they wanted certain antibodies to be included or not, or if they wanted to be able to look at different offers. Unfortunately, due to data burden, that wasn't able to be included. But I think in thinking about a modernization of this system, I do think it's important that we have more opportunities to have data directly uploaded into the system so that the burden doesn't come onto the centers to have to hand enter all of this data, and then also have have a choice as to which data they want to enter or not. I think that they have a choice as to whether or not they want filter offers to be filtered out because of unacceptables, things like that. But I do think that we're not going to know for sure until we get complete data. And right now, as Matt pointed out, we don't have complete data. So we have a vague understanding, but not a complete understanding.
Okay. Excellent webinar. I'd like to thank all of our speakers. Excellent presentations and discussion. Thanks again to ISHLT for facilitating this webinar. And again, please enter your public comments, and maybe we can make some improvements here for our patients. Thank you all.